How do you make a choice? Do you reason it out, weigh every element, consider every path? Or do you trust your gut? Trust yourself, take a leap of faith. Or maybe you simply flip a coin. How do you make a choice between life and death when you don't know which is which? Sometimes I wonder why my parents chose to settle on New Montana. It was never exactly a land of milk and honey. The terraforming was only barely holding on, and civilization consisted of a couple of small towns and isolated farmsteads. Maybe they thought it had potential, that at some point the ecology would stabilize, and towns would become cities, and the cities would become rich. Maybe they thought about the future we would have there, my little brother and me. But still, I wonder what they were running from when they left Earth. And I wonder why they chose to stay when the war started and New Montana became a frontline colony. Maybe they believed in the cause. Maybe they didn't have anywhere else to go. Looking back, I wonder if they simply never really thought that the war would reach us. It was my mother that woke me that night. I think I was already half awake. I remember hearing the rumbling in the distance like a distant storm. Then my mother's hand on my shoulder shaking me out of sleep. "They're here! Leah, wake up! They're here!" I was Leah Ingrid Olson. I was 13 years old, and I'd lived my entire life on New Montana, and everything I knew was about to end. "What?" I mumbled, still barely awake. "Who's here? What's going on?" "The Kurzasker. They've landed outside the shield. We have to go." The what? I turned the unfamiliar syllables over in my mind. Then it hit me. We had half a dozen slang names for them, the other kids and me. Curries, roaches, knifers, and so on. Their real name was too hard for us to pronounce, but somehow, with everything else going on, my mother said it perfectly. And it hit me like a bucket of ice-cold water. They were here. The aliens. They'd come to destroy the colony. We'd been doing evacuation drills at school since the war started 3 years earlier. I'd done so many that, to me, as a child, they seemed like just a normal part of life. If the attack had come while I was at school, I'd probably have gone through the motions by rote, lining up with the other children and heading for the nearest bunker. But at home, at night, with my mother shaking me and the sound of explosions in the distance, "Leah, get up! We need to go!" My mother's whisper was urgent, on the verge of begging, but I was frozen, gripping my bed covers, willing this to be just another nightmare. This couldn't be happening, it couldn't. Then there was an explosion much closer, close enough to rattle the windows, and a moment later I heard my little brother crying from the next room. Somehow that was what made it real for me. I'm up! Go get Noah!" I threw the covers off as my mother rushed to get my brother. What do I need? What do I need? The question went round and round in my head. I was only wearing a t-shirt and shorts, and the first thing I thought of was I should get my bra because that's what I always did when I got up. It was stupid, it wasn't as if I even needed it back then. But that's what your mind does when you're panicking. Fixates on the little, easy thing, so you don't have to think about the big, terrifying thing going on outside. I grabbed my hairbrush because in those days my long blonde hair tangled like tumbleweed the moment my head touched a pillow. Then the windows shook again and I finally snapped out of it. I had to get out of here now. I ran into the hallway, and in the dark I almost knocked my mother over. She was carrying Noah, who had his face buried in her shoulder. He didn't have his blankie. He was 4 years old and he never went anywhere without his blankie, and I wanted to go and get it for him, but there was no time. There was no time. They were here. I slipped my pink running shoes on, and my mother grabbed my hand and dragged me out into the night. The first thing I felt was the cold. As the night air bit into me, the first thing I saw was the flames. The storage tanks at the edge of the town were on fire and casting orange light and flickering shadows out across the streets and homes. A man ran past at a full sprint, so quick he was gone before I could even think to ask him what was happening. Where were the enemy? How many? What direction? Where was safe? Then I finally thought to ask, "Where's Dad?" "With the militia." He'd left without even saying goodbye. I imagine that moment sometimes, when I have too much time on my hands. When the alert came through on his phone, and he realized the day he'd spent 3 years praying would never come was finally here. How did he react? Calm, collected. I have to get to the armory. You take the kids to the shelter. Or did he freeze up like I did, sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily, until my mother had to shake him, remind him of his duty? Did he think he was going to die? Or did he tell himself it was probably just a false alarm? The latter it must have been. He never said goodbye. It would only have taken a second. My mother gripped my hand like a vice and led me through the maze of alleys. Cheaper to build houses small and close together. Half the streets were nothing but dirt tracks, and it had rained earlier, so it wasn't long before I had mud streaks splashed up my bare legs. It was so dark. The enemy must have used an EMP on the town. The power grid was out, and not even the security lights above people's doors were on. The only light to see by was the flames rising in the distance. Not so far away now, though. I could smell the smoke on the air, feel it stinging the back of my throat. Street by street, winding our way towards the shelter for our section of town. It wasn't a big town, only about 30,000 people, but it was strange how empty the streets were. Our house was near the outskirts of town, a poor neighborhood even for New Montana. Most people must have already made it to the bunker, or they never found the nerve to leave their homes and sat there in the dark, waiting for the enemy to reach them. It started to rain again. We turned a corner, and then suddenly my mother yanked my arm, pulled me back into the shadow of the building. I was about to complain, whine about how she hurt my wrist. Then I heard the sound of footsteps splashing through the mud, and the snap hiss of an energy rifle being fired. The fires cast shadows down the street, past the mouth of the alley. Long shadows, shadows with too many arms, too many legs. Quietly, praying Noah wouldn't so much as a whimper, we went back the way we'd come. Circling round, trying to find a route to the shelter that was safe. More pitch-dark streets, more blacked-out buildings, round and round until even though I'd lived in this town my whole life, I wasn't sure where we were. I wasn't sure my mother knew either. Every so often another person would appear out of the darkness for a moment and disappear again just as fast. Once or twice I heard shouts, like militia calling out orders, and a couple of times I heard screams, but other than that, just the wind-driven rain rippling across the rooftops and the sound of distant gunfire. We passed bodies, face down in the mud. I tried not to look. When Noah turned his head, I stepped into his eye line and smiled like nothing was wrong. "Don't be scared. We're just going to the shelter, like in the drills," I whispered. "Don't look at the street. Just look at me. Kaylee, I love you. Love you too." Every corner we came to, we stopped, peeking round quickly, darting back. Every couple of turns, we found the way we needed to go was blocked. Silhouettes that only bore a passing resemblance to the pictures on the propaganda posters advancing through the town. Then we came to one of the main streets, one that actually had paving. I knew we had to cross it. There was nowhere to go this time if we went back the way we'd come. They were closing in around us. The snap hiss of weapons fire greeted us, and I stopped short as energy bolts flickered past the mouth of the alley. My mother tried to drag me back again, but this time I pulled my hand away and crouched down by the edge of the building. There was a barricade down the street, 2 half-tracks pulled across to block whatever was advancing from the other side. A couple of men, militia, firing from behind the meager cover. I don't think my father was one of them, but I'll never know. I only glanced for a moment, but it was long enough to see a man fall, a glowing hole through his torso. The crackling bolts cut lines of steam through the rain, whipping down the street in front of us. Dead end. We couldn't go on. We couldn't go back. How do you make that choice? Run out into gunfire, or go back and maybe meet the enemy advancing through the streets towards us? One path leads to death, one path leads to life, but there's no riddle you can solve to tell you which is which. You just have to choose without knowing. How do you make that choice? I knew there were enemies behind us, moving up. I didn't know what was on the other side of the street, and I didn't know if I could make it without being caught in the crossfire, but at least there would be a chance. I gestured across the street, but my mother shook her head. "We have to!" I shouted, but she wouldn't move. I ran for it. I felt my mother's fingers snatch at the hem of my shirt, but too slow. They slipped away. Then I was out in the open, An energy bolt blinked past right in front of me and stopped short. Took a step. Lights flashing all around me, I froze. I almost turned back. Then something in me snapped, and I ran the last few meters to cover. An energy bolt just grazed my shoulder as I reached the mouth of the alley. I half spun, tripped, and landed face first in the mud. But I made it. I propped myself up on my elbows, then scrambled into a crouch. I was soaked. Rain, mud, my own blood. But I made it. I thought my mother would follow if she saw me make it. If she saw it could be done. She wouldn't leave me alone, she'd have to follow. She'd have to. She wouldn't leave me. In the darkness on the other side of the street, past the flashing lines of energy, I could see her, crouching, holding Noah tight against her body. I beckoned to her, but she wouldn't move. I started to get desperate, glancing round the corner, seeing the bodies pile up at the barricade. I knew it was only moments before the enemy smashed through and came this way. I stood there waiting for my mother to make the sprint across. Then, in growing disbelief, as I realized she wasn't going to do it. I think I was crying, or maybe it was the rain streaming down my cheeks. I'd left my little brother behind. That was what made me sick to my stomach. I should have grabbed him from my mother and run across with him. I wanted to go back, but I knew there was no way I'd make it across twice. The enemy were breaking through the barricade. I was out of time. One last time I beckoned my mother to follow me, but instead she turned away. I think that was her way of giving me permission. She knew she'd left it too late, but I still had a chance. I hung there for another moment, a part of me not believing I could really do it. Then I left them and ran, alone, into the night. There were fewer of the enemy on that side of the settlement, but I almost ran into them a couple of times. No way I could get to a shelter. Not now. I couldn't make it to the entrance, and even if I did, they'd be sealed shut by now. So I headed for the scrap yard on the edge of town. I played there with the other kids. I knew it well enough to find my way around even in the dark. It wasn't just old bits of metal and a couple of cars. There were stacks of old industrial machinery and farm equipment, saved to be cannibalized for parts. Plenty of places to hide. I half expected it to be crawling with aliens, but it was deserted. The battle became flashes of light in the distance, punctuated by thunder. Just another storm to shelter from until it passed by. I crawled into the outflow of an old harvester and sat there, dripping wet and shivering. And then I started to sob. Because my mother wasn't there, sure, and my dad. There was a part of me that was quite certain I'd never see either of them again, but mostly because I'd left Noah. I'd left my little brother behind. I could have grabbed him. I must have fallen asleep at some point. I'd pulled the hatch of the outflow pipe closed when I got in, or closed as far as it would go, so it was almost warm from my body heat. I blinked my eyes, then sneezed. There were still dried up husks of wheat everywhere. My shoulder burned a little from where I'd been grazed, but it didn't seem too bad. Then I realized that through the gap where the hatch didn't quite close, I could see light. It was dawn. I went to open the hatch. Then I realized that if any of the fucking roaches were anywhere near, I'd be committing suicide. I waited a moment, then realized I really needed to pee. I thought about doing it out the hatch, but maybe that would give me away, so I crawled as far into the harvester as I could and did it there. Then I waited. I waited all day. I tried to keep myself occupied by singing my favorite songs, but I didn't dare make any noise, so I just sang them in my head. Other than that, all I did was pee again and tried to ignore the pain in my shoulder. I kept waiting until a few hours after nightfall. Then when I didn't hear anything outside, I crept out and drank some of the water that had collected a hubcap. Then I crawled back into my hiding place and waited. 4 days. That was how long it took for me to get so hungry I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't hear sounds of fighting anymore, but although I dreamed about going home and finding everything the way it was with just a few scorch marks on the walls, and the militia and my dad were heroes because they'd fought off the roaches, that was just a dream. I was pretty sure that there was no fighting because the roaches had won. But I figured it was better to take the risk than die of starvation. So I waited until it got dark again and started trudging back towards town. There was a part of me that didn't even care if I got killed. The lights were still out, and I was able to slip into the narrow streets without any chance anyone who wasn't looking specifically saw me. Automatically, I started heading for home. Then I realized how stupid that was and picked the nearest door. Unlocked. Empty house. Like everyone else, the occupants had left in a hurry. There were muddy prints on the floor, so someone must have been through here recently, but I couldn't tell who they belonged to. Either way, there wasn't so much as a whisper, so I headed for the kitchen and started shoveling food out of the cupboards and into a plastic bag. Then I heard a noise. I froze, but then I realized it was coming from out in the street, maybe some way off. A rumbling, growling noise like heavy machinery running. My first instinct was to hide. My second instinct was to run back to the scrapyard, but instead, I left the food behind and started creeping through the alleys towards the noise, because it meant there was something still alive here, probably the roaches. I knew it was a really bad idea, but I had to see. In my mind's eye, I saw a pen full of prisoners, and my parents and my little brother jammed in with the rest of the town. And if I could find something to cut the wires, I could sneak them out. I heard voices and dived into cover in an open garage, shaking because I realized just how stupid I'd been. Everyone knew the roaches didn't take prisoners. I could just have gone back to the scrapyard with the food, but now I was stuck here, and if they found me, they would shoot me dead on sight, or save me for their knives. 10 minutes, 15. I curled up under a workbench and prayed. Prayed that whatever was out there would pass by. Instead, the voices got closer. I waited, and I waited, until I could barely breathe anymore. Then I realized the voices were speaking English, and cautiously, I crept out of my hiding place. Colonial Marines. It was over. I was safe.